Thank you, Tony. Welcome, everybody, to this month's Connect with Remedy webinar. Today's topic is Remedy 9, ITSM Suite Administration and Maintenance Best Practices. We have several presenters today, including myself. We have Doug Reif, Mark Walters, and Sally Ludwig. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to Mark, who will go over today's agenda. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so today we're going to be having a look at what we've called ITSM administration. Administration means many different things to different people. I think the area that we're going to be focusing on, or the areas that we're going to be focusing on, are more likely to be called sort of maintenance and health of the system. So we're going to be looking at the types of things that you need to be doing on a regular basis to help maintain your system in a healthy and good state. We're going to run through a number of different types of cases, different types of things that we think you should be taking into account and checking regularly. There'll be a set of references at the end to material that's called up, KAs and the like during the presentation, and then hopefully plenty of time for questions and answers from the attendees to dig into the material in more detail. So next slide, please, Steve. So as I said, what do we really mean by administration? In the context of this presentation, what we're looking at is the maintenance and the health of your system. So using a sort of automobile analogy, the types of checks that you want to be doing on a regular basis to make sure that your system is in a good state and is behaving to or performing to the best of its ability. So the types of things that you do before a long journey, checking the level of the fluid, the oil in the car, checking the tires, but also then when the system's running, having an idea, an expectation of what the performance of the system should be, and looking out for deviations and variations away from that performance that might give you an indication that there's something going on in the system that needs your attention and could, well, maybe a warning of a problem developing. And the idea here is to make sure that you understand the way the system behaves normally and will give you plenty of warning ahead of problems developing that may become more serious. So next slide, please. And over to Doug for the first topic.
Okay, the first thing we want you to look at is log files. So we want you to review the log file space utilization in the DB directory or whatever directory you're storing your log files in of all the servers in your server group. And we'd like you to understand what's in those directories and remove any old or unneeded files and archive them if necessary. And this might be obvious to you, the need for doing this is a lot of people enable logs, plus there's some logs that are always enabled. You know, there's the AR log is always enabled, AR exception log is always on. So those files can grow and grow and grow, and if you don't routinely monitor how much space they're using, you could end up with a problem where you don't have enough disk space to even start AR server. So the benefit of reviewing these logs is that it reduces the file system disk space and it keeps your logs relevant. So another point here is if you do call support, often we ask you to send logs. We usually ask you to use the maintenance utility to call the log zipper and zip up all your logs. Well, it's going to zip up all of the files that are in that DB directory, and if there's a lot of extra files in there that are consuming a lot of space, you're going to have a much bigger file to send to support, and they're going to have to go through and prune out a lot of unneeded stuff. If you look at the next slide, Steve, I'll show you an example of what a one directory that I was looking at looks like here, and you can see there's some files in the DB directory that are taking well over a gigabyte, and they're from 2016. And I don't really know why the customer left those. It could be that this was from a very specific test case and they didn't want to lose them. But in any case, these are not probably from the current situation. And when we're looking at logs, we have to remember to eliminate those. It would have been better to either delete them or archive those into another directory. So that's the first step, is just make sure that you keep an eye on this DB directory and what logs are going in there and what logs need to be moved off. So we can look at the next topic then.
Thanks. So the next area is what we're calling processing forms. So there's a number of different areas that we're talking about here. An ITSM system has many different types of forms that make it up. There are those that are used to store the data that you're entering, but there are also a lot of behind-the-scenes forms which are used for transactional data, for passing information between the different modules, or for kicking off scheduled action or jobs that you may be running. We'll look at some more detailed examples in a moment, but generally what we want to be able to do is to keep an eye on the volume of data in these forms. Although on the whole they're self-maintaining, for example, forms that trigger other actions, records should be created and removed by the system on the fly. It doesn't always work as expected, and if you're not careful you can get a build-up of records which can have an impact on performance of the system, or again they may be indicative of a problem that you're not aware of, delays in mail notifications being sent, that type of thing. So what we want you to do is just be aware of the different types of forms that the system uses, what the usual content of those forms should be, how quickly the records should be created, deleted, and what it means if there's a sudden change in the number of records that you see in those forms, and they will then give you an idea of where to go and look in the system to try and understand what might be causing that change in behavior. So next slide, please. So the different types of forms, so process control forms. So these are, and there are some examples there in the forms column. So these are forms where records are created to trigger activities. So they're not necessarily records intended to be stored for a long period of time. They may not contain all of the data related to a particular activity, but they're used almost as switches, if you like. So the expectation here is that records are created and deleted pretty quickly, and overall the volume in these forms should be maintained at a low level. If you see a sudden uptick in the number of records, or records that have been around for a very long time, it's probably worth trying to go and have a look and understand what's going on. Queue forms, so process queues. So these are similar, but the records are more likely to contain data that's being processed. So rather than a message to go and do some work, this is the data that's actually being worked on. So the email messages form, for example, is obviously data that's coming into and maybe leaving the system. Configuration of the system may be such that those records hang around for an extended period, but usually the volumes are on the low side. And if there is a large volume in there, DSO pending would be a good example. If there's a large number of records in there, it probably means there's a problem with that area of the system that needs to be looked at. The process storage forms. So here we're thinking about forms that are used to record data over the longer term. So the flashboard history is a good example, and the server statistics. It's information that you've elected to maintain, but again, you probably want to put some limit on the amount and the amount of data being retained and the length that it's being held. If you let the data in these forms grow and is not managed, you have the potential for causing a growth of your database and unnecessary storage space being used, but also performance. Many of the systems that use these forms will suffer search performance problems if there are a very large number of records in there. Similarly, the process logs, so things like the UDM and DDM, the email error logs, these forms record the results of activities or of processes and may be useful in the short term to let you know what's happened and provide a trail, an audit trail or debugging information about a process that's been taking place. But again, probably not required long term and should be actively managed. Next slide, please.
All right, Data Wizard jobs. So this is an area within ITSM that could potentially cause performance problems. The Data Wizard can be used to modify certain ITSM foundation data, such as company name, site name, and login ID in all the applicable forms. Executing this function may impact performance So we strongly, strongly recommend that this should not be performed during peak business hours. And on a monthly basis, we suggest that you review the Data Wizard's View Audit Log. Within this audit log, you can see who ran the job and at what time. And if you happen to notice somebody constantly running a job during business hours, during peak business hours, you basically can reach out to that person and talk to them and let them know, hey, when you run these during the day, it's going to really impact performance. So it's just something to check on a monthly basis to make sure you're adhering to the non-peak business hours. All right, and Doug, over to you. Next slide.
Okay, so I already talked about some of the logs, and I mentioned error log, but I want to focus a little bit closer in on the error log. You actually should not just look at the size of the error log, but which you should, and then if it's growing too big, make a backup of it and move it off someplace. But you should also look at the contents of the error log and make sure that you know what's going on in there. I regularly, as a support person, I regularly look at error logs and find messages that aren't being dealt with. And you know, the admin should be looking at this log. It's there for a purpose. And one of the things the error log does sometimes, it shows a lot of error messages that you don't care about. For example, you might see an escalation that fired on 1 million records and it got some sort of error on every single one of them, and it wrote 1 million lines. So you kind of have to wade through the lines that, yeah, you know it's an issue, but you're not wanting to deal with it today. But if you look at the next slide, I showed some examples of errors that I pulled out of some customers' logs that I'd found. One was error in failover monitor. The SQL database operation failed because the error system is full due to log backup. Whatever that error meant, there's a problem in the database that probably should have been handled. So that would have been an important error to spot. Another one was cannot establish a network connection to the error system plugin server. So some functionality isn't working. You may not be aware of it. Some of the end users might not have complained yet, but there is some functionality that's missing because of that. Here we have another error, FTS action, SQL database operation failed because the password expired. Well, that's something that you can deal with. If the database password expired, you can fix that. And if you were monitoring the error log, hopefully you found this before a whole bunch of end users were unable to perform some work. And one more error I saw there, and this has to do with cleaning up your directories, is in this particular case, their drive that was running error system only had 15 megabytes available, so it was virtually full. And because of that, error server started, but the next time they try to start it, it may not start with 15 megabytes available. So again, all these messages here are things that are might be found in your error log, and we just highly recommend that you keep an eye on that log. And like I said about size, also if it grows huge, you might want to move that off so that what you're looking at really is the current relevant information. So next topic. So another log that's always on, so this is one of those logs that you want to keep an eye out for size and prune it, is the error exception log. But again, other than pruning, you also want to look at the contents. If you haven't ever looked at the error exception log, it's really a valuable log. It records every time there's a client timeout. So you may think, oh, my end users tell me every time they have a timeout, that way I can deal with performance issues. They may not, but this log captures it. If you look at this log, you'll see every time that any of your end users experience a timeout error. It also can be used to record long-running queries. There's a feature that we're not going to talk about today, but a couple of versions ago, we added to the server statistics feature. So if you go to the admin console and you look at the server statistics tab, there's a section there for recording long-running API and SQLs. And one of the options is to have the long-running APIs and SQLs right to this log, the error exception log. So it's a great log to look for identifying performance issues. And of course, the benefit is that you would find these performance issues and solve them before your end user community is complaining about it. If you look at the next slide, I have some examples of lines that I pulled out of an error exception log. The first one example there, that block shows the SQL operation elapsed time has exceeded the configured threshold. Now this means that I went to the server statistics tab and I set some threshold. By default it's 5 seconds. And what that means is every time any SQL or API takes longer than those 5 seconds, it's going to write it here. And this is what happened here. A SQL statement took 281 seconds. And so obviously it passed the threshold, and it wrote it here, and it wrote the SQL statement that actually failed. I didn't show the entire SQL statement. I put the ... at the end, but you would get in the log the entire SQL statement that ran. The next block there shows what happens if a client times out. API and SQL operation did not complete prior to the client timeout. So the client did time out, and they timed out at 120.7 seconds. Probably this activity was a 2-minute timeout, so they only missed the timeout by 0.76 seconds. So this in itself, just barely timed out, but still it's good for you to be aware that your end users are sitting there waiting and then sometimes getting a timeout message, and you know exactly what call it was making, so it might help you proactively fix some of these problems for your end users. Next slide. Another tool you have, I mentioned the server events, another tool you have to look at sort of the health of the system is server events. So server events can be used to track a lot of different things. They track and record various administrative type of activities. And the benefit of using this tool is that you can identify changes to objects or configurations and make sure that the timing and activities are in line with your change policies. For example, we're going to talk a little bit later about monitoring config changes. Well, the server events can help you monitor every time there was a config change. If we look at the next slide, you can see exactly what types of changes that you can monitor with the server events. So in the top block there, you can monitor all kinds of admin type of activities, changes to all these different objects. So in this case, we're looking at form changes or people that are performing imports. If someone's performing an import, I better know about it. So this way I get it recorded. Anytime someone makes a change to users or groups, and in this case, server settings, server group action, perform server group actions, or even when there's a client timeout, all those types of things based on the check marks here are going to be recorded. Now, once you set this, there's a form that stores all this information, and now you got to look at that form. So if we look at the next slide, this is one example of what the form looks like. It's kind of kludgy. It's maybe hard to read because it's all codes. So if you see it's all about the event type and the event cause. So I paste on the top here a link that will also be in the reference section of this document that has the sort of the decoder ring. If you look at that page, it'll tell you exactly what event type 12 and cause 8 is. But this is what you would use every time one of those activities occurs that you ask to monitor. A record will be put here, and you can know exactly what type of change was made. So we hope that you would use this utility. It's there, it's been there for a while, and you can use it just to keep an eye on what type of activities are happening in your system. Next slide.
So Doug, this is a good example, I guess, of one of those forms where the data can grow quite quickly if you leave the feature on. So it's maybe something that people, if they have a concern about a particular activity on the system they're trying to understand, they can turn it on and turn it off again once they're done. But again, if you're not careful, a lot of data can be gathered in these types of forms very quickly.
Yep, good point.
Hopefully, you won't ever see one of these. In Remedy version 9, the AR server process is now a Java process. It was moved from C in the earlier versions. Under certain circumstances, if the process fails, so either perhaps through a coding problem, a defect in the server causes an exception that can't be handled, or possibly due to a resource constraint, memory, for example, then the Java virtual machine can fail and may result in a heap dump. Now, the heap dump is usually the contents of the process memory. So whatever the server was doing at the time, the heap dump is created that contains pretty much all of that data. So it can be a very large file. So the heap dumps, if they do get created, will be in the default logs directory, in the DB directory. So it's just something that you want to take a look for every now and again. And if you do notice one, you want to try and understand what may have happened. The file itself, you're not going to be able to do very much with. and you're probably even sending it to support, we may not be able to do something with it straight away. But if it's, take a note of the fact that something's happened, and if you see a repeat occurrence, then that's probably a good time to open a case with us so that we can try and investigate further. One thing where we know you will see a heap dump is due to configuration of the heap space in Java. By default, I think the current version ships with a configuration of a maximum of 6 gigabytes of memory for the JVM. There's a KA that contains a set of recommendations based on the size of your environment, the number of users that you're expecting on the server, which will recommend increased values for that. So if you start to see these, first thing to do maybe is to have a look at the AR server conf file, the AR server d or arserver.config file that's in the conf directory, and that'll show you what the current maximum heap size is. Then go and check the recommendations KA for the number of users that you're running and see whether it might be an opportunity to increase the maximum heap size to give the process a little bit more memory. The other thing, obviously, if they are full dumps of the memory and taking a lot of space, you have the same potential there for running out of disk space on the system drive where the Remedy server is running, which can cause you problems when you try and start the system up at a future date. Next slide, please.
On the mid-tier, we want to try to establish a golden set of the different parameters that affect the mid-tier performance. You know, this could be your Tomcat version, your Tomcat Java options, the config.property settings. All of those are going to affect your mid-tier performance. So once you have your golden set, then the mid-tier check would be to verify that those settings have not changed or have changed with your consent. As far as log space, we are really more concerned about the web servers logging. The mid-tier logs will not grow beyond the limitations that you set in your config.properties. If you set that it will be 10 files of 10 meg each, then your mid-tier logs will not grow beyond 100 meg. So you can set that. And the other thing that we would like you to do is regularly check for heat dumps. If you find one, open a case for review because there's something that we probably can do to help you. The benefit of doing that, of course, is if you have unexpected changes to your web server, to Java, to your mid-tier config properties, those cause errors or performance problems in the mid-tier component. So regular checks will help us prevent those. Next slide.
Full text search is a key component of your ITSM environment. So if it's there, you are using full text search, or in some way you might be using it for global searches or other things. But it's important that full text search be running and working and up to speed. So you want to make sure that users that are modifying data, that when that data is modified, it's updated into the full text search. So we would like you to analyze the contents of the FT pending table to gauge the health of FTS. The FT pending table, if you've never looked at it, is a really good window into the health of full text search engine. And if you monitor it, look at it, see what's in there, what's being worked upon, you can use it to proactively identify potential indexing and searching problems. If you go to the next slide, I showed a kind of example of the contents of my sample FT pending table, and here you can see it has the server names of the server name column is the server name that submitted the job. So some user on those servers modified data, so it needs to be re-indexed, and then you see the index server name. And if you are in a server group and you have multiple indexer servers, then this shows you all the different servers that are supposed to be indexing that data. So the kind of things that you're looking for is, are there a lot of records in here? If there's a lot of records, say hundreds of thousands, maybe your people are modifying data and that data is not searchable because it hasn't been indexed yet, and you want to know about that. So you can look for patterns in here, like perhaps it's just one indexer server that's not keeping up. And so I provided a simple SQL statement here that will allow you to do a query and just look at, it's going to show you all the different indexer servers and how many jobs they have yet to do. So in this case here, there's only 35 each, and the reason why there's 35 each is I had just performed a full reindex, and there's 35 forms that are being reindexed. And so in this case, both of my servers haven't really gotten into it. There's 35 forms yet for them to be indexed. In your case, if you ran this, you're going to see something different. But what you're going to see is going to tell you for each indexer server, how well is it keeping up? And that should help you identify problems. Hopefully what you do, you come in here and you look, and there might be 20, 30, maybe 100 records, and you come in here and you look an hour later maybe, and you see, you know, a different 20 or 100 records. So it's actively keeping up, and it's showing you that people are actively modifying records or adding records that need to be indexed, and that's a sign of a healthy indexer. So we do want you to keep up with the contents of this. That way you can proactively identify a problem before your end users just simply aren't finding data that they should be finding. So next slide.
So archiving, particularly in respect of the ITSM software, is something that really improved in version 9. For any of you that tried to implement an archiving policy for your data, ITSM data in earlier versions, I'm sure you would have run across the problems of trying to work out which bit of data was related to which other record. So you have incident records and their related work logs. One of the features, or the key feature that came in version 9 to help with this, was the associations. So out of the box, the ITSM system now ships with these associations that defines links between the different form types and the dependencies on them. And the archiving processes are driven off of that. So when, for example, incident data is archived, there are associations that link to the other related forms that also can drive the archiving of the related data. Benefit of using these policies, obviously you can manage the amount of data that you have. Not everybody needs to keep all of the incidents or all of the changes that were ever created. You may have compliance policies, perhaps related to the industry that you work in, or to do with particularly with the corporate standards that you have, that mean that you need to retain data for certain periods of time. The archiving policies can help here and make sure that that data, that requirement is enforced in the correct way. And obviously by managing the amount of data that you have in the system, if it's not needed anymore and can be moved off to different tables and out of the main database, you can help improve and maintain the performance of your system. So next slide, please. So the policies that are used that are ship out of the box and are used by the ITSM system are managed through the Archive Manager console. If you take a look here, you'll see the list of ones that are shipped and are available out of the box. Most of them are disabled by default. They have a default set up, but we want you to have the option, obviously, of when that is enabled. The archiving is also now what we call continual archiving. So you don't need to worry about setting up a daily interval. It fires automatically, and those policies that are enabled will take effect. The data in those forms and the forms that are defined by the associations will be moved to their archive forms, and you'll be able to maintain a suitable level of data in all of your system forms. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay, the expirations and licensing. This is just sort of about keeping up on probably things that you pay for, or things like passwords, licenses, certificates, and other data that has expiration dates on it. And the idea here is just that there are things that are going to expire. You need to be aware of it before it expires. You know, for example, we get customers that have SSL certificates that have expired, and all of a sudden it's a support issue. And we think that you should proactively be aware of those and check on them before the problem occurs. If you look at the next slide, I show some examples of things that I've seen. An example errors, the SQL database operation failed because the password has expired. So if you keep up on those things, if you know that the SQL password has an expiration on it, then hopefully you proactively change it before it becomes expired. Next example is a certificate that expired. You know, a lot of times SSL, probably all the time, SSL certificates have an expiration date on it. And you should be aware of that, record that somewhere so that you can make sure that you get a new certificate put in before it expires. And I gave some examples on the top of things that you might look at. You know, database accounts, service accounts, like if you're, an example of a service account might be is if you're using MAPI with your email engine, well then the email engine's running as a service account. And that service account probably has an expiration, it's probably 90 days or less. So make sure that you change that password and you update the service before that time period is up. Licensing also is something to look at. Make sure that, you know, even with Remedy, make sure that if you have a license, maybe you have a temp key or a license that expires, make sure you understand when it's going to expire. With your database, your operating system, your web server, all those pieces, you may have a license that expires, and you just need to stay on top of that. And so we just recommend that you add this to your maintenance list and have dates and times to go through it, and whatever interval that you need to keep up, then we recommend doing that. So next slide. So we mentioned forms like the server statistics, flashport history, server events that are forms that can grow very large. And so this is sort of a takeoff on things that we've already talked about, but we specifically think that you should keep an eye on form sizes. There are some forms like maybe HPD Help Desk that you know you have to keep, maybe your retention policy is you have to keep 7 years of tickets in your live, I don't know what your policy is, but perhaps you have to keep 7 years of live data in that form, and you could have tens of millions of records in there, and maybe that's fine, but you should still keep an eye on it, and if you expect tens of millions of records, you should see, you know, that very thing. But you also, by looking at the form sizes, you might find there are other forms that have a lot of records in it that you weren't aware of. And the whole purpose here is to make sure that that something isn't growing out of control and perhaps taking a lot of disk space and affecting performance. So on the next slide, I show an example of a SQL script that's attached to this knowledge article. Don't show you the script. You can go and grab that knowledge article, and I think this is also referenced in the reference slide at the end. But when I run this script, either for Oracle or SQL Server, I get output that, and it's not always this pretty, I pasted it into a nice pretty table here, but you get these columns that show you in order of the highest row count. This shows me here that, yes, I had server statistics on, and I have 3.7 million records that are stored in there, and I had no idea until I ran the script. So some of the other things in here are this time entry form. I knew that there was a lot of records in there, 137,000, so that's what I expected, but I didn't expect that there was 40,000 records in my email error logs form. So that gives me a couple places. The server events and error logs, I might go back and clean up now that I know that I have a huge number of records in those forms. So this is a nice tool for you to use. Use it periodically and just keep check of the growth of your forms. We'll look at the next
Doug, I think as well, Doug, maybe worth, as well as the volume of records, if you're doing this on a regular basis, it's worth historically looking back and looking at the rate of change. So for a couple of reasons. So firstly, it may help you with forecasting. If you can see that your number of records in certain key forms are growing at a particular rate, you can help with your planning for capacity planning going forward, but also look for sudden changes in the volume of records, because that may be, as we talked about in the processing forms slide earlier, if you see a sudden difference in the rate at which records are being created or deleted, you might just want to go and investigate and try and understand what's happened and what's caused that sudden change.
Yeah, perfect example. And maybe something like the system email error logs form, if you saw that growing hugely all of a sudden, that may be indicative of another problem with your email engine. So, yeah, great point. Next slide then. So this is the last item that we want to look at, is just this idea of looking at your best practice settings and keeping up with them. You can use the BMC best practice documentation, which is linked on the next page. Also use actual use cases and personal knowledge of your environment to develop and maintain what we call a golden master of your configuration settings. So BMC provides best practice documents, but you need to understand those best practice documents are in lieu of a better practice. You or the administrator or your team probably has a better idea of what your actual settings are. For example, the best practice documentation talks about setting a certain Java heap size depending on your size, number of end users you have. Well, you may know better than the best practice document that you need a certain Java heap size. For another example is the best practice documentation talks about the number of private sockets and how many threads to set on those. Well, depending on your specific environment, you may need a completely different number than that. And one final example is the results, the maximum results list. We say that the maximum should be 2,000, but you may have a specific need to have 3,000, for your environment. So your best practices are going to be different than the best practices documentation. In almost every case, there'll be some of them that are different. So what we recommend is that you use the best practice documentation, come up with your own best practices, set that across all of your servers in your group, make sure all your servers are set up properly, and then save that as a golden master. Now, you may know that in the centralized configuration console, you can save configurations. So you can name them. So you can get it all set up and you can save it as your golden master. You can also, there's a knowledge article that will help you export all your configuration as a CSV file so you can look at it in Excel. So one of the things that we then want you to do is do sort of a drift analysis over time. And we're saying monthly here. It may be more than monthly, depending on how many people you have that are actually making configuration changes or have the ability to make changes. We think that you need to, on some interval, at least monthly, take a look at your config changes and compare against your golden master to make sure that you don't have, one example might be is somebody left logging on and they set the log size to a gigabyte. They set logging on. Well, if there was a particular need to enable logging, great. But if they've left that on, you probably don't want that. You probably want to come back and check and say, hey, the golden standard for the debug mode is 0, no logging on. And if I see that on, then I know that either somebody's doing some kind of diagnostics or I need to turn it off. And you'll find that when you do this comparison. So it's just a good idea to understand what all your settings are, what they should be, and then compare against that. Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, so if you're, when you look at the recommendations, the best practice recommendations from BMC, and you find that one of your values is significantly different to one of the ones that perhaps we've come up with, I think it's probably also worth making a note and documenting the reasons around that. Because when you do raise a case with support and you submit the configuration information to us, one of the things that the support team are going to do is take a look and look for those values that are way outside our expectations. And there probably is a perfectly good reason why you've done that, but it's just helpful if that's noted somewhere and can be, and when that information can be shared, so that it can either be, we can rule it in or rule it out as being related to a problem that's being investigated.
Yep, good point. So that is actually the last recommendation that we have, and then our comments. Mark?
So, yeah, thank you. So The references here are to some of the knowledge articles and documentation that's being covered during the presentation. When the recordings, if any updates to this come around after the recording, when it's posted on the community's website, we'll update the list of references. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in summary, I hope we've tried to cover a number of the key areas that we in support regularly see as causing issues for customers. Things like the growth of records in volume, number of records can cause surprises. I recall a case where we found a customer with hundreds of millions of records in the FB history form. They had no idea they were there. They were just wondered where all their database space was going. So by having this regular maintenance routine, by trying to put some processes in place around checking your configuration, checking your volume data, checking your passwords, expiries, all of that kind of thing, we're trying to hopefully lay out a set of guidelines which will just help you keep an eye on the system, make sure that everything's ticking over nicely, and that you're minimizing the chances of surprises coming along and causing you problems. Okay, so over to the Q&A now, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Tony, operator, if you can provide instructions to the audience to how they can ask a question live.
Yes, thank you. If you would like to ask a question on the phones, please signal by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. Please make sure that your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. A voice prompt on your phone line will indicate when your line is open. We do ask that you please state your name before posing your question. Again, *1 to ask a question over the phones. And we do have a couple of questions in queue. We'll go to our first question.
Yeah, hi. This is Jason from AT&T. I don't know if this question is related to the best practice, but during our ITSM installation, the configuration checking tool reported many warnings, as best practice settings. But and if the warnings are there, the silent installation won't go through. So we have to do a manual installation. Go through the GUI interface. Is there any way we can disable or flag this warning to be ignored so we can sort of use the silent installer? That's my question.
So just to be clear, you're saying you want to use the unattended install option, but when you do that, the configuration checker is throwing up some warnings. That means that process stalls?
Yeah, and it failed. It will exit.
It fails it?
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any options, for example, to bypass the configuration checker. It's something we can follow up and try and find out for you. But yeah, I can see why that would be a problem. Do you know what were the type of warnings it was throwing?
Yeah, there's some Java settings in the arserverd.com file, and there's some CAI timeout settings that's recommended. A few things like that. I mean, we sort of added something in the followed by the instruction. We added the entries, but the configuration checking is still fitting, and we weren't able to use the silent installer. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a solution to this. So we end up using the manual install, and there's an option to skip those warnings during the manual installation.
Okay, yeah, we will follow that up and see if we can find out for you. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
We'll take our next question on the phones.
Yes, this is Jerome Dancer. And at one of the previous places I was working, every time the AR server was restarted, they saved all the log files, but they took and they put it in a different directory, but they took the directory and put it in the subdirectory under the DB directory. At the time, I told them that I didn't think that was a good idea, and they fought me and actually continued doing it. And I just want to find out whether I was right or wrong on that.
I'll venture a guess on that. If there's a reason why you wouldn't want to put it in the same directory structure is it's still using the same file system. And so if one of the things you might want to do is offload files from the whole file system that AR Server's on, just to make sure AR Server always has plenty of disk space. So that's one reason you might want to move it to a different drive altogether. But other than that, there's not really a reason why you couldn't put it into a subdirectory. I think when LogZipper runs, it does not grab subdirectories. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it does not grab subdirectories of the DB directory, so it wouldn't grab those. So that's a valid way to archive them and yet not have it automatically brought in with a LogZipper.
Well, my concern, though, was the size that it ended up getting, because we were having a lot of problems with the system at a time, like having searches that would run for 3,000 seconds and things like that. So we were doing a lot of restarts and things, and some of the logs were pretty big. And I was just concerned about the size that it would end up being.
Yeah, I would too. And for that reason, I think it's great. I see customers that have a separate drive dedicated for logs, and it offloads them, so you don't have that time when AR Server crashes because there was no free disk space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so okay, I think there's a lot of merit to moving logs when you can, either archiving them or having them directly write to a different file system or different partition.
Okay, thank you. That answered my question.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few more questions in queue. We'll go to our next question. And caller, your line is open. Go ahead.
Is this Tony?
Yes, sir. I'm still on with you. I've opened the line for our question and waiting for them to speak. Caller, your line has been opened. If you would, please try picking up your handset or pressing your mute button.
Hi there. Sorry about that.
Thank you, sir.
I just want to, learn more about some, security point of view. There are, a lot of, information, you shared about, the SQL API, SQL queries, all this stuff, right? So how do we, protect, these type of, informations? Is there a way to, store in the database? So I'm just, looking at, some options because whoever, logs into the server, they don't have to, see all these, these business logics like the SQL queries and all this stuff. So when it generates a log file, is there a way the log can be encrypted, or the other option is it can be just stored in the database? That was my question.
Yeah. So some of the if you look at the server information form and where the log files are turned on and off, there is an option for some of those logs to be logged to form rather than logged to file. So that data can be collected in the database. If I understand correctly, you're concerned about the sensitivity of the data that's being recorded in the log files, particularly with respect to the SQL. Yeah, with respect to the SQL logging, we're recording the values that are being transferred and are being saved.
Exactly.
Yeah, we don't have any sort of log obfuscation option or anything at the moment. It's not a feature that's available in the product, and it is something that does cause an issue sometimes with sensitive customers who aren't allowed to ship data out for support reasons. But if you're concerned within your own environment, say some of the logs do have a log to database, a log to form option, but unfortunately not all of them. For example, some of the peripheral components, the Java plugins and that type of thing, which don't directly have access to the database, can't take advantage of that. So there are some things that can be done, but it's not across the full scope of the product.
Okay, thank you.
And we still have a couple of questions in queue. Again, that is *1 to signal to ask a question over the phones. And we'll take our next question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay. It's Teresa Norris, and I had a question about the AR exception log. We recently had worked with BMC on an issue, and they had us turn it on. We had to restart our services. So my question is this: is it something that we should keep on all the time, or turn on and off based on whether we're troubleshooting or not?
The AR exception log, part of it, half of it is always on. So the part of it that captures the client timeouts is always on. And the idea here is that customers aren't always getting timeouts. So we don't expect it to be, we're hoping that in most cases it's not a very quickly growing file. Hopefully you don't have, hundreds of times a day that users are timing out. But that's always on. What you can enable is the part that's from the service statistics, and hopefully that's what you saw. You go to the service statistics tab, and there's a check box for exception logging. That's what you can enable, but you can set a threshold so that the only thing that gets logged from there are APIs and SQLs that go beyond the threshold that you've set. So if you find that the default threshold of 5 seconds is creating a large log that you don't feel comfortable leaving that running, you could still get some value out of it by setting that number to a higher value, say 20 seconds. Most APIs and SQLs you would probably expect would be finished in less than 20 seconds, and for the small number that didn't, you're happy with that level of logging and that quantity of logging. But that's kind of up to you and how much you're actually seeing getting written to that log.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask another quick question? I'm sorry. Is that okay?
Sure.
So it has to do with the sample data. We have one environment that we chose not to install the sample data, and now what we're running into is it also did not install some of the workflow forms, active link guides, and we're getting some errors. Is there a fix for that, or something that we can do to correct that problem? In other words, getting the missing workflow. Yeah.
So the sample data, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but I'm not aware that any workflow or forms is part of the sample data. I thought that was only. Yeah, it literally is only data. So if you've got problems with active links and workflow missing, that suggests that there was some other problem during the installation. It's not related to the sample data.
Well, so I would think so too, but I did differences in Migrator and found that the forms that are missing have the word sample in them. So maybe I'm making a conclusion, but it's just too coincidental. Do you know what I mean?
Can you think of Can you think of an example? So I mean, the sample application, the training sample application is the only one I can think of. So yeah, I think we'd have to probably the best thing there would be to discuss that with support and see if we can understand it. We'd need to have a look at some more details to be able to understand what happened.
All right, thank you.
And again, that is *1 to signal to ask a question. We do have one question left in queue currently. We'll go to that question.
Hello?
Please go ahead. Your line is open. We can hear you.
Okay. My question is the best practices that you presented. I'm asking if they're fit for a small organization. I mean, for an IT department of 14 people.
Sorry, would you repeat the question, please? Which settings?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Sorry, yeah. Would you repeat the question, please?
Okay. So my question is the best practices that you present, if they fit for small organizations or naive departments of 14 people.
Yes, to a certain extent. I mean, some of them, for example, the ones to do with monitoring the volume of records may be less applicable. I would expect that with a smaller number of people, your system's going to grow at a slower rate. But certainly things like looking at recording your configurations so that you're able to audit changes to the environment and make sure that you understand how it's configured. Checking the error logs to make sure that there are no things going on that you're not aware of, no timeouts on the clients, no errors from the database that perhaps people haven't reported. All of those are applicable regardless of the size of the environment. It's maybe just a case of to what extent you apply them.
Yeah. The question that we need people to check all these items. So what do you recommend for this case? Depending on the tool that they use, for example, be Remedy.
Doing an analysis like to identify what like your best practice configuration settings are. It's all. I mean, there's a lot to do with baselining. What are your goals? You might have a goal that every API is less than a certain number of seconds. So you can use other tools. We have tools like the SQL and API logging to make sure that your performance is within spec or within your goals. And if performance is outside of that, then you can start looking at what configuration changes that you can make. If you read the best practice document that's in the reference page there, it has a lot of recommendations on setting sizes, but it doesn't explain necessarily the detail about why you set it that way. But our online documentation does. There's a performance tuning section of our online documentation that goes into detail about what each setting means. And I think that's really what you need to do is you need to understand if you need a certain number of private threads or a certain number of fast or list threads, why do you need it? Why are you setting it that way? The best practice guide or the document, it takes 3 different sizes of customers and it uses them as to baseline. If you had less than 500 end users, then you might have settings this way. Well, it sounds like your environment is much smaller than even the range of our small environment. So you probably really need to understand what each of the settings that are recommended, what they actually mean, and so that you can kind of apply it to your specific case. So I'd recommend going to the performance tuning section of our online documentation and try to understand what the settings mean.
Okay, thank you.
And once again, that's *1 to signal. And we'll go to our next question.
Hi, guys. This is J.D. Hood. I had a question about some of the logging that I find customers just do not want to turn loose of. One of them being the notification logs. The problem we've had when you can easily rack up millions of records in that over, a year or so or a couple of years of ticketing. And when you do try to trim those out, the impact is that in the notification audit log attached to the ticket loses those audit entries. It seems to be fed from the notification log form. So given that you've got a form that may have millions of rows that if they're checking notification logs when a customer calls and says, I never got the notification, Well, they're going to go to the notification log and check the ticket to see if the notification was sent. How do you have any ideas for managing those logs when you can't, for some reason, whether it be policy-based or just like for the notification log where it's part of the audit trail for notifications? How do you manage that when you can't trim the database row count in those tables, especially if it's a table like, the NTE logs that can potentially be searched, get queried every time somebody goes in to check for notifications in that audit feature? Is it a question of, is that a database issue more or less, or are there any ideas within the remedy system itself that can help with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some of these forms do have some out-of-the-box escalations for tidying them up, but the notification one specifically, like I said, with the auditing, I can't think of a good, easy, quick answer, other than really you need to make sure that you don't remove records that are older, that are younger than the oldest parent record that you need to retain. If you are collecting huge amounts of data, you could potentially look at archiving it. I guess it's a case of how frequently is it accessed, and what's the acceptable time frame that you can live with to restore that information, or to actually be able to dig it out if it is required. So that the information could be archived to another form, but obviously then it's not searchable from within the ITSM interface itself. It's a job for an administrator to actually go and find that information if it's required. But yes, I agree. It's a challenging system to deal with.
It is I know we can separate database indexes off on different spindles, different drives, to try to either speed them up or lessen impact on the system. But and it's been a while since I've messed with that, but there's nothing like that and I haven't looked at it since, say, version 7.6 or so. I haven't really paid attention to the under the covers for version 8 and version 9. There's nothing like that for entire tables, is it, where we could take the notification log table and split it off onto a different spindle in the database system?
There is, yeah. The general rule there is whatever you do at the database level has to be transparent to the application. So the customers have moved whole tables into different table spaces. But the key is you have to be able to do it without the application needing to modify the SQL that it uses to access the table. So as long as it's still accessible using the SQL that the server generates, it should work quite happily. It's just one of those things where you need to be a little careful and test it thoroughly first. So there is a configuration file, the ARDB configuration file, which allows some customization of SQL. So for example, customers sometimes move indexes move the indexes for tables onto different table spaces. But we would class it, I guess, as advanced configuration, and not something that we provide any out-of-the-box interface to enable you to do. But it can be done, but with caution.
Okay, we'll look at it from the database side. Now, it's one of those things you sort of throw over the fence to the DBA and say, here, you deal with it. If you can figure it out. But anyways, yeah, it gives me an avenue of exploration.
Yeah, you certainly need to. They would be a good person to engage, but the key requirement is that it's transparent as far as the AR admin user is concerned, and that it doesn't require any additional clauses to be appended to SQL statements.
Yeah, I understand. Got that clear. Yeah, good. I'll check into that. Thank you, sir.
And for any of the for any system that is 9.0, I mean, we did ship archiving as that is a child to the policies of ITSM and SRM, as you probably noticed, but it doesn't have its own. NT notifier does not have its own. It's not a parent, and so it doesn't have its own policy, because we know it's a child that has to stay with a parent record until the parent is archived. But I guess it sounds like the archiving option doesn't suit everybody because it may still be growing too much.
And again, that's *1 to signal. We'll go to our next question. Caller, your line is open. Please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, this is Jerome Dancer again. We have 3 environments, and production, test, and QA, of course. And over time, the environments have gotten horribly out of sync, where they've done development in a QA environment and then moved it up to prod, now starting in development, things along those lines. And now the customer is demanding that we synchronize all 3 environments. What management has suggested doing, and I think is a very bad idea, is just copying the production database down to QA and then copying that database down to development. To me, that sounds like it's going to present us more problems than it will answers. Am I correct in that?
Customers do that. Some people do that. It's a good way to, at one point in time, to keep them all in sync. So you wouldn't necessarily do this all the time, but it would be a way to get them all in sync, assuming that your production database was, again, I use the term golden master. If that's what you wanted to keep was the production environment, you could copy that into your lower environments. One immediate problem you'll have is server names, and so we do have documentation in our online docs. In fact, it's written just for this, to how to change the server names so that you don't carry the production server names into your QA and lower environments. So it's an acceptable way to get them all in sync. We have some customers that do this on a regular basis. They make sure that any changes that were in QA get published to production, so they don't just get lost when they bring the database down. So if they had anything in QA that needed to be done, they publish that to production, and at that point, they're able to sync production with all the other environments. And so that's acceptable. It just depends on how you roll out changes, and if you're up to date with your changes, and your particular needs.
And I think another thing to be aware of is if you have processes that are triggered, so escalations, for example, that maybe call integrations and integrate with other components, you want to make sure that they're turned off when you take on the clone databases. If maybe you have an escalation that generates notifications, you don't want your copy databases sending out the same notifications. So you might want to take steps to isolate the copy environments from the wider environment until you're happy that all of those integrations or timed processes have been turned off or reconfigured.
Okay, as another bit of that of information there is that some of the production that has been done, some of the development that's been done in QA has been moved up to production, but the application does not work in production. It works in QA, but it doesn't work in prod. We don't know why, and so I don't see that. I mean, I think that could present us a problem moving the prod database back down to QA.
Yeah, that's a good example of when to be cautious. If you know there's going to be a problem doing it, I'd take care of that problem first, but you make a good point.
Okay, so the suggestion would be then to determine whatever the problem is in the production environment with this specific application not working in it before we try and move that back down to QA.
Exactly. Yeah, ultimately, it should work. I'm assuming that whatever the problem is, the expectation is that it should work in production. So if you could solve that problem, then you'd be able to go to the next step. Then production would be, at that point, it could be your golden copy, and then you could drop it into your lower environments, but only after it was working perfectly in production would you want to do that.
Okay, so anything that's not working properly in production, we need to get that running properly first before we try and move it backwards.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, that would be the ultimate goal, is you'd want production to be, and I keep using the term golden, but you want it to be, quote unquote, golden. You want it to be as perfect as you can get it. You may never achieve that, but at some point you have to say, it's golden enough for me to make a copy of it and drop it into lower environments.
Okay. I think that answers my question. Thank you.
And once you do that one time, you might feel more comfortable. Because I know, like I said, we have customers that do that. Probably once they did it one time, they got a certain comfort level. They know how to do it. They drop it into other environments. They clear out the server names so they don't have that issue. And now they've done it. Now it becomes easier 2 months from now when they want to resync. So they do it again, and they have a certain comfort level. So I think once you get this first run at it done, maybe you'll see that you could, a little bit easier in the future to keep doing that, to synchronize your environments.
But we're not going to have any problem with licenses or licensing or anything along those lines, because we've got different licenses on each of the environments. We don't have as many licenses in QA as we do in prod and that sort of thing. So we're not going to have any issues along those lines?
Well, licenses are stored in the database, so you're not going to have issues, because that'll be one of the steps that you'll have to resolve. You'll have to, when you drop the database into your lower environment, you'll have to reapply the licenses. The existing licenses from prod will be ignored in your QA environment, because the licenses are tied to your MAC address, so they simply won't get used. So you'll have no licenses. So one of the first steps you do is apply the licenses back into QA.
Okay. Well, I guess, as you say, I'd probably get a more of a warm fuzzy once I do this once, but never having done it before, I just thinking of all the possible things that could go wrong.
Yeah, definitely practice it. Practice it before you destroy your QA. When I say destroy, before you, maybe destroy isn't the word, but before you drop it into QA on top of what you have, you might just want to practice it. Drop it into a new environment and then test it that way. And then once you have a warm fuzzy in a new one, maybe you want to create a UAT or a dev, some other test environment. But then once you have a warm fuzzy there, it works, it's licensed, and you can prove there's no server name conflicts. Then you'll feel better about dropping it into a more important environment like QA.
Okay, that's a good idea. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we're standing by with no further questions signaled at this time.
Okay, and Tony, at this time, I just want to remind the attendees that if you have asked a Q&A, if you asked a question in the Q&A section and you have not received an answer, don't worry. We will address it when the Q&A is posted along with today's webinar recording. We'll do maybe a last call for any live questions. Hit *1. You have a question to ask.
And we do have a couple more that have signaled up. Question?
Hi, Eric here. Hope you can hear me.
We can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, maybe I can add that we are one of the customers doing the database copies quite often. So after each new functional release, we're doing these database copies. One thing maybe you can or should make sure is to stop any of those mentioned escalations for example, fetching emails from productive mailboxes. Yeah, so yeah, you should figure out what kind of things are is taking data from any production environments or interfaces. Those should be turned off, and yeah, only start the non-productive AR server after you have corrected maybe some of those Boolean flags on the database. So that's probably the major case you need to take care of. Then a question from my side is regarding the FTS tuning you mentioned. So we saw in our environment in the recent times lag or delay of up to 4 hours in the full text search. My question is whether you have any reference for these FTS tasks to be tuned. So where should we get where should we correct any settings, maybe threads or heap size or anything?
But there's probably two I can think off the top of my head places that you can tune FTS. One is the number of threads for the 390.602, which is the FTS private socket. That will be the number of AR server threads that deal with indexing. And I think the recommendation in 9.x is a minimum of 2. In 8.x, we always said to use only 1 thread because we had some contention. The Lucene libraries that we use had some contention issues if you had more than 1 thread. We don't have those anymore in 9.x, and so we recommend having a minimum of 2. Now the maximum is up for debate. It just kind of depends on your environment, but it's possible that you could get better throughput, better keeping up with the indexing by adding a thread there. And that's probably the key place for tuning the indexing. I said there's 2 things that you can tune. You can add threads to the Java, the num core threads to the Java plugin server for FTS, but that really only affects searching. So if your problem is just keeping up with the indexing, I mean, probably the first thing I'll do is look at possibly increasing the number of threads, maybe try 4 on that 390.602 and see if it increases the throughput. You can use that SQL statement. There's also you kind of want, if you can, you kind of want to know, I don't want to get too deep into troubleshooting here on this phone call, but you kind of want to know what the rate is that it's indexing and find out, is it just simply an overall slow rate, or is there some other reason why it takes 4 hours? So one of the things I do is create a ARFT index log, let it run for a while, and just look at it and go through it and see if you can figure out what the rate is. How fast is it doing a record? Is it doing 10 records a second or 300 records a second? Or is it doing 1 record every 2 minutes? Because if that rate will help you identify why it may not be keeping up. And you may have you may need to create a support call. We may need to work on that if it's a very slow rate, and increasing threads doesn't help.
Okay, well, thank you. So currently we are on 8.1. So I guess one thing I will look into is giving some more threads on this queue. And what would be the best practice rate there, or at which rate should the FTS be indexing?
Well, 8.1 is different. Primarily because in 8.1 we found some issues and we fixed them in 9.x, and they're kind of foundational changes that can't be backported to 8. So one of the first recommendations we tell you is try to upgrade to 9 when you can. But 8.x was different in the sense that it used plugin server for the indexer. In 9.0, the indexer is built into AR server. So in 8.x, you can also increase the num core threads on your indexer plugin server. That might help as well. Like I mentioned, in 8.x, we don't like you to increase the number of 390.602 threads too much. You could try 2, you could try 3, but just do it sort of as a test. See if it helps you achieve a higher throughput and doesn't cause problems. So you might want to try it on a weekend. You know, you can watch it and it won't affect, it wouldn't affect end users anyway. What we've seen is if it gets into a contention situation, all of a sudden the rate becomes much slower. So if you increase your threads from 1 to 3, very few customers, but some, saw that the throughput went slower. So you might be one of the majority of customers that you increase it from 1 to 3 and you actually see a twofold benefit.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much.
And we'll take our next question. Caller, your line is open. Please go ahead. To the caller, you will have just heard an announcement on your line that said your line is now open. Again, your line is open. Please go ahead. You may try picking up your handset.
Yeah.
We can hear you now. Go ahead.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah, my name is Max from Switzerland. I have just one question regarding the indexes. How can I find out which indexes is missing, or do you have any tools which we can run against our system to find out which indexes we should put in place or delete from the database? That was my question.
We don't have a tool per se. I believe over time I have written scripts to help find that, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head if there's one that we generally give out. Basically, to tell you what to delete, that's a little more difficult because you might have created an index at the database that works and it serves you great, but it's not, Remedy doesn't know about it. It's not a form property, so we're not aware of it. So whether or not you should delete that is going to be kind of up to the database administrator.
Okay.
But
yeah, go ahead.
So to identify missing indexes, one nice thing you have available to you is there's a table, there's a Remedy database table, and this will mean more to your DBA, but there's a table called schema_indexes, and it lists all the indexes, and it adds the actual name of the index. And so your DBA can look at that and do a comparison of that table with the actual indexes. It's probably going to be thousands of indexes in there, so you wouldn't visually look at it, but you can quickly write a script that would go and check and see if every index listed in the schema_indexes table actually exists as an index.
Okay. That is the way to find out which index are missing in the system.
Right. Which indexes that have been defined in Remedy as an index that are missing in the database.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And we are standing by with no further questions at this time.
All right, we'll just give it one more moment, and I'll check with you, Tony, and then we'll go ahead and wrap this up.
As a reminder, it's *1 to signal on the phones. Have no one signaling at this time.
Okay, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. This slide here gives you the ways of contacting BMC through BMC Communities, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and also the technical support phone information. So we want to thank you for your attendance and participation in today's Connect with Remedy webinar. Today's recording will be posted within the BMC Communities within 1 week from today, and we will also be including its posted, we'll also post the Q&A. So again, if your question did not get answered, don't worry, it will get addressed in the posted Q&A. Thank you very much, take care, and have a great rest of your week.